It was an ordinary afternoon in the small town of Bellevue, where life moved at a gentle pace. The sun cast a warm glow over the cobblestone streets, and the townspeople went about their daily routines. The baker kneaded dough with practiced hands, children's laughter filled the square as they played, and elderly women shared stories about the day's events. It was a peaceful, familiar scene, a perfect day in this close-knit community. But that calm was shattered when Sister Elizabeth, a nun revered by all, was seen entering the most talked-about store in town, the adult shop that had been the subject of whispers for months. The sight was nothing short of shocking. As she walked through the door, the quiet town erupted in murmurs. Eyes widened, phones were pulled out, and within moments, a photo of the nun entering the store was snapped by a curious teenager and shared online. The gossip spread like wildfire. Some questioned Sister Elizabeth's commitment to her vows. Others wondered if her faith had wavered. The once peaceful town buzzed with judgment and confusion, unable to make sense of the unexpected sight. Inside the store, the atmosphere was just as tense. The young clerk, used to the occasional visitor, had never expected to see someone like Sister Elizabeth. Her brightly colored hair reflected her surprise as she looked up to meet the nun's calm gaze. "Good afternoon," Sister Elizabeth said gently. "As always, I need to speak with the owner." News of Sister Elizabeth's visit to the adult store spread like wildfire through Bellevue. It didn't take long for the town square to become the hub of heated conversations. Groups of people stood in small clusters, exchanging gossip, their voices hushed but full of disbelief. Some shook their heads, clearly unable to comprehend what had just happened. "Has she abandoned her vows?" one woman whispered, eyes wide with confusion. "Maybe she's not a nun anymore," another muttered, speculating about a sudden change in Elizabeth's faith. The photo that was circulating online only made matters worse. The image of the nun entering the controversial store was shared and reshared, with people making harsh and judgmental comments. Some condemned her for breaking her vows, while others turned the situation into a spectacle, mocking the idea of a nun stepping foot in such a place. The small town, which had always prided itself on its strong sense of community, was suddenly divided, with whispers of scandal filling the air. Outside the store, the murmurs grew louder. Passers-by exchanged their theories, trying to make sense of the unthinkable. "What was she doing there?" one woman asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "A nun in that place? It just doesn't add up." The townspeople were baffled, unable to reconcile the sister they had known with the actions they had just witnessed. Father David, the parish priest, was one of the first to hear about the commotion. His initial reaction was one of concern. He had always known Sister Elizabeth as a kind and devout woman, dedicated to helping others, so the news took him by surprise. He wasn't sure how to address the situation, feeling both bewildered and troubled by what had transpired. His first instinct was to hope the scandal would pass quickly, that the rumors would die down as the days went on. But deep down, he knew that this incident could cause a much deeper divide within the community, a divide that might be hard to heal. He paced back and forth in the quiet of the church, wrestling with his thoughts. On one hand, he knew the importance of protecting the reputation of the parish, but on the other hand, he could not ignore the fact that Sister Elizabeth had always been a beacon of compassion, someone who believed in understanding and offering help without judgment. Father David had always admired her willingness to help others, even when it was difficult. But now, the situation was far more complex. The community needed answers, and he wasn't sure how to provide them. As the whispers continued, Father David could feel the weight of the town's judgment bearing down on him. He had a responsibility to the people of Bellevue, but also a duty to Sister Elizabeth, a woman whose actions, though puzzling, might have been driven by something deeper than what was immediately apparent. He feared the consequences of the scandal, unsure of how it might affect not just Elizabeth, but the fragile unity of the community as well. Inside the adult store, Rachel, the owner, was just as stunned as everyone else. The sight of Sister Elizabeth, someone so respected and familiar in the community, was completely unexpected. The store, a place that had always attracted judgment and scrutiny, was now the scene of an entirely new and perplexing encounter. But rather than reprimanding her or expressing any shock, Elizabeth greeted Rachel with the same warmth and compassion she had shown to countless others in her life. "I imagine this is unexpected," Sister Elizabeth began, her voice calm and serene, as always. "But I came here to understand your story, Rachel. I've heard things about you, but I prefer to hear the truth from you directly." Rachel stood still for a moment, her arms crossed defensively across her chest, her eyes sharp with skepticism. She had lived with judgment for so long that it was hard for her to believe that someone, especially someone like Sister Elizabeth, would approach her with anything other than disdain. "My story isn't interesting," she replied, her voice guarded. "I'm just trying to survive." But Sister Elizabeth wasn't deterred. She didn't rush her or press for answers. She simply waited, offering an understanding silence. After a moment, she spoke again, gently asking, "Why did you choose this business, Rachel?" Rachel let out a heavy sigh, her eyes dropping to the floor as if the weight of her choices pressed down on her. "It wasn't an easy decision," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My family was in deep debt. I had younger siblings who needed me. No one offered help, no one asked why I was doing this. All they did was judge me, make assumptions about me, about what kind of person I am." Elizabeth listened intently, her gaze softening with empathy. She understood the heavy burden of judgment, the kind of weight that made people feel isolated and desperate. "I understand how difficult it must have been," she said, her voice calm but filled with compassion. "People are often quick to judge without knowing the sacrifices others have made. It's easy to point fingers, but it takes real effort to understand the reasons behind someone's choices." Rachel looked up, her face hardening, but there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. Something raw, something that spoke of years of feeling misunderstood. "But what do you think, sister?" she asked bitterly. "What would you do? I've tried everything. No one has ever given me a chance. I've always been the one people look down on, the one they gossip about." Sister Elizabeth's expression remained warm, unwavering, as she took a step closer. "Maybe we can change that together," she said, her words infused with hope. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because I believe in you, Rachel. You deserve to be heard. You have a story that matters." For a moment, Rachel remained silent, her defensiveness beginning to crack, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope. It wasn't easy for Rachel to believe that someone could truly care for her without an agenda, without ulterior motives. But Sister Elizabeth's words resonated deep within her, offering something that had been missing in her life for so long. Compassion without judgment. The nun didn't offer a quick fix, and she didn't offer any grand promises. She simply acknowledged Rachel's struggles, recognizing her humanity in a way that others had not. And in doing so, she offered Rachel the first real chance at understanding, not just from the world, but from herself. As the conversation continued, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Elizabeth's presence wasn't one of judgment or condemnation. It was one of empathy and patience. It was a rare gift in a town that had long been quick to make assumptions. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in the town's quick judgments. She saw beyond the labels, beyond the judgments, and saw Rachel for who she truly was. A woman trying to survive in a world that had never shown her compassion. Rachel's voice softened as she continued to speak. She spoke of the sacrifices, the loneliness, the exhaustion of constantly feeling judged. The walls she had built around herself, walls formed by years of neglect and harsh judgment, began to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of Sister Elizabeth's understanding. "I've never had anyone speak to me like this before," Rachel admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I never thought anyone would want to listen." Elizabeth smiled gently. "You're not alone, Rachel. I'm here, and I believe in you." In that small, unexpected moment in the back room of the adult store, something shifted. The tension, the judgment, the fear of being misunderstood all began to melt away. What replaced it was the possibility of change, of understanding, of compassion, of a community learning to look beyond the surface. Rachel wasn't alone anymore. And perhaps, just perhaps, this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for Rachel, but for the entire town of Bellevue. The next day, the town of Bellevue was filled with even more gossip than before. The photo of Sister Elizabeth entering the adult store had only fueled the whispers, and rumors were running wild. Some believed it was a sign that Sister Elizabeth had lost her way. Others whispered that perhaps the quiet, compassionate nun was hiding secrets no one could have imagined. The usual chatter in the town square was laced with judgment, and eyes were glued to smartphones as people scrolled through the image over and over again. It seemed as though the small town was in the grips of a scandal, and everyone had an opinion. But Sunday Mass arrived, and the air of gossip that had swept through the town quickly dissipated as the congregation filed into the church. The pews filled, the familiar murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned toward the altar. Sister Elizabeth, as serene and composed as ever, took her place before the congregation. There was a subtle tension in the air, and even the hum of the old church seemed to hold its breath. As the Mass began, Elizabeth stood before them. The weight of the past few days hung in the air, and she knew her words would be met with mixed reactions. But she also knew she couldn't remain silent. It was time to speak, time to address the elephant in the room. "Brothers and sisters," she began, her voice steady, but filled with quiet conviction. "I know you've all seen the photos circulating these past few days and may be wondering why I entered that store." Her words hung in the air for a moment as she made eye contact with the congregation. "Let me be clear. I went there to speak to Rachel, the owner. She's not the person many of you think she is. She made a difficult choice out of desperation to save her family from debt. She is not a sinner, and she does not deserve to be condemned." The words seemed to land heavily on the crowd, a collective intake of breath filling the church. The congregation, for the first time in days, was silent. There was no judgment, no muttering. For a moment, Sister Elizabeth saw the familiar faces of the townspeople searching her own with quiet curiosity, as if they too were waiting for her to explain more. But Elizabeth knew there was more to say, and she continued with unwavering calm. "I know that some of you are shocked, some of you are confused," she said, her voice carrying throughout the church. "I understand why this news may have stirred emotions in you, but I ask you to listen with open hearts. Rachel is not the villain some of you have made her out to be. She did what she had to do to protect her family. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one she could make when the world closed its doors on her." A few heads nodded in understanding, but there were still murmurs from some corners of the church, voices of dissent rising. Sister Elizabeth knew the path to changing hearts was never easy. It would take time, and not everyone would come around immediately. But she was undeterred. "I urge you to look beyond appearances," she continued, her voice firm yet gentle. "Ask yourselves, what would you have done in Rachel's place? If it were your family in debt, your children needing food, your loved ones at risk, what would you have chosen? Would you have done the same? Would you have let pride or judgment stop you from saving the ones you love?" Some in the congregation seemed to be taken aback by the question. Elizabeth could see the flickers of contemplation on their faces, and she knew the seeds of change were being planted, even if just for a few. She paused, letting the silence stretch between them, before speaking again. "If we want to be a community rooted in faith and compassion, we must show kindness and understanding. It is not for us to cast the first stone. We are all human, all fallible, all in need of grace. But we must choose to offer that grace, not just to those we love, but to those we do not understand." Her words were simple but powerful. The message was clear. Judgment was not her path. Understanding was. Compassion was. And she wanted her community to follow that path with her. Sister Elizabeth could feel the weight of the moment in the room. The flickering candles cast a soft light over the congregation, their faces thoughtful, some uncertain, but all listening. The energy in the church had shifted. It wasn't that they all agreed with her, but they had paused, just for a moment, to reflect. And that was enough. As she finished her homily, Elizabeth looked around at the people who had been a part of her life for so long. She felt a quiet sense of hope. Change wouldn't come overnight, but the conversation had begun. And maybe, just maybe, this small town could begin to see one another through a different lens. Maybe they could let go of their assumptions, their judgments, and begin to offer compassion, just as she had. As she walked back to the altar and the congregation began to stand for the next part of the service, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had spoken the truth, and now it was up to them. After Mass, Sister Elizabeth stood firm in her decision. She had expected the whispers to continue, but she knew that if change was to happen, she had to act boldly. So, she arranged a community meeting, determined to provide a platform for Rachel to share her truth. The room was filled with anxious anticipation. The townspeople had come, some out of curiosity, some out of obligation, but all were eager to know more. There was a heaviness in the air. Would this be the day the town began to heal? Or would it be another chapter in the gossip-filled saga that had already begun? Rachel, who had been uncertain and hesitant about stepping into the spotlight, stood at the back of the room, her fingers nervously twisting together. She hadn't asked for this kind of attention. She hadn't asked for the life that had led her to open an adult store in the first place. But now, here she was, standing before the very people who had judged her. She could feel their eyes on her, piercing, full of expectation. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But then she saw Sister Elizabeth standing by her side, offering a comforting, silent reassurance. With trembling hands, Rachel took a deep breath and stepped forward to the front of the room. The murmurs in the crowd died down, and the room became uncomfortably still. Rachel hesitated, then began to speak, her voice wavering at first, but slowly gaining strength. "I didn't choose this path willingly," Rachel began, her eyes cast downward, focusing on the floor. "I did it because there was no other choice. I wanted to help my family, but no one ever asked me why. They just judged me." Her words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. The weight of her statement resonated with the crowd, and slowly, the murmurs began to quiet. The harsh judgments that had once filled the town square seemed to fade, replaced by a growing sense of understanding. The walls that had once divided Rachel from the townspeople began to crack, bit by bit, as they realized the depth of her sacrifice. Rachel continued, her voice steadier now, though the rawness of her story still carried an edge. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I never wanted to be the cause of scandal. I only wanted to survive. I wanted my family to survive." Her eyes met those of the people in the room, and for the first time, she felt as though they were seeing her. Not the label they had put on her, but the woman beneath it. The woman who had struggled and fought just to stay afloat. The room was still, as if everyone was processing the weight of her words. Some of the older women who had been the loudest critics of Rachel began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. One by one, people started to approach Rachel after the meeting, their faces softened, their expressions apologetic. They offered words of comfort, and some even suggested they could help her find a new path, perhaps a way to leave behind the adult store and start something new. The idea that had once seemed impossible, that she might be able to escape her past, now felt like a possibility. Father David, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stood up. His face was thoughtful, as though he were wrestling with the same questions that had been haunting the town. He had seen the toll that judgment had taken on both Rachel and Sister Elizabeth, and he knew that something had to change, something greater than the whispers of gossip that had consumed the town for so long. "What if we could turn this into something positive?" Father David said, his voice steady but full of hope. The room fell quiet again as all eyes turned toward him. What if Rachel's store could become a place where the community could contribute together? A place for artisans, local craftsmen, and young people seeking work? A place where people could make something beautiful, something that reflects who we are as a community, not just as individuals, but as a collective. The idea struck a chord with many in the room. The concept of transforming Rachel's adult store, a symbol of judgment and scandal, into something new, something that could unite rather than divide, felt like a breakthrough. People began to murmur excitedly, voices rising as they discussed the possibilities. Could they really change the course of Rachel's life and the life of their town? It was a bold proposal, and not everyone was immediately sold. Some people, still clinging to their old judgments, were hesitant, but the majority of the room seemed to embrace the idea with enthusiasm. There was a palpable sense of hope in the air, as if the town could rewrite its narrative, turning what had been a place of division into one of creativity and collaboration. Sister Elizabeth, watched as the energy in the room shifted. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The gossip that had once torn the community apart was now giving way to dialogue, to a shared vision of redemption and renewal. The adults in the room were no longer clinging to their past judgments, and even the young people seemed energized by the idea of creating something new together. "I think we can make this work," Rachel said, her voice stronger now, her fear replaced by the spark of possibility. "I don't know how or where to begin, but I'm willing to try." Sister Elizabeth smiled softly, her heart full of pride. She had known all along that Rachel was capable of more than the label the town had given her. And now, with the support of the community, Rachel would have the chance to prove that, not just to others, but to herself as well. The meeting ended with the promise of something new, something that could reshape the future of Bellevue. The townspeople had begun to see beyond their judgments and embrace the possibility of a new beginning, one built on compassion, understanding, and a shared vision of a better future. As Rachel and Sister Elizabeth walked out of the meeting room, side by side, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, heard, and valued. And as they stepped into the fading light of the afternoon, the future seemed full of promise, not just for Rachel, but for the entire town. In the months that followed, the transformation of the adult store was nothing short of remarkable. The community came together, volunteers rolling up their sleeves to turn the space into something beautiful. Il Punto di Partenza, the starting point, was born. A charming artisan shop filled with local crafts, art, and stories of new beginnings. On the grand opening day, the town square buzzed with excitement. The very place that had once been a symbol of judgment now stood as a beacon of hope and change. Rachel, standing beside Sister Elizabeth, felt tears welling in her eyes as she prepared to cut the ribbon. "I never thought I'd get here," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing something in me that no one else did." Sister Elizabeth, holding Rachel's hands, smiled warmly. "You did it, Rachel. And now, you have a community that believes in you." As the crowd cheered, Elizabeth's message resonated deeply. Compassion, understanding, and truly listening to someone's story can break down even the toughest walls of judgment. The town of Bellevue had learned that kindness and open hearts could transform lives. We invite you to share your own stories of judgment and compassion in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share, and let's spread the message of empathy and understanding together.